So after playing with Svelte for a while, here's the big big reason though is the whole tractor system has a very no Node.js ecosystem rule, and that's because it's kind of a cancer. And I really hate that the JavaScript community just doesn't even try to do anything better. It's just assumed if you're writing JavaScript, there's an NPM module for it. Once you introduce NPM modules, you have one NPM module, you're likely now to get hundreds of NPM modules. There is no discipline on dependency management, which is, at the scale of software that we have now, sort of the key to creating simple software. Minimize your dependencies. And the JavaScript ecosystem can't do that. Plus, there's all these historical reasons for why they'd have all these different versions for different kinds of things, and so you have this crazy matrix hell of complexity and configuration that any of the core stuff, Webpack and NPM modules, all that stuff is all dealing with. We're finally getting to a point where some of these things are finally standardized in a way that also works in browser, which then is sort of the authoritative source of standardization. You have ES6 imports, stuff like that. It's really helpful. So at some point, you kind of need to start over, and that's kind of the idea of what Hot Web was about. And if you're starting over, you might as well do some of the stuff you're doing in a real systems language. And I like that the JavaScript community is starting to figure that out. They're starting to port stuff to Rust, which is maybe a little bit too silly. It's fine. I wouldn't recommend it. You could also do it in Go. Some of the stuff has been happening in Go. Obviously, ESBuild, for example. Look at this. There's even a Go port project for the TypeScript compiler, which will be amazing. I have no idea how long it will take, but if it was done in Rust, I'm sure it would take at least twice as long. So anyway, the problem with Svelte is they're just as, even though they're talking about rewriting Svelte in Rust, the problem with that is whenever people in the JavaScript ecosystem say they want to rewrite something in Go or Rust, they still design it to work in that ecosystem. And so it's bringing all that baggage with it. There's this project, SWC. This was a Rust-based version of ESBuild. But unfortunately, it wasn't really made to be used outside of JavaScript, and it was just made to be used within that ecosystem. ESBuild is a lot simpler, and it also is made to sort of be a drop-in replacement in whatever, and I think Vite actually uses ESBuild. It can't only use ESBuild because of things like I mentioned with CSS. What's obnoxious is that they're sort of saying, hey, we'll use ESBuild because it's nice and fast. But I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure Vite itself is written in JavaScript. So TypeScript, nice, but it's still a node thing, and it's still an NPM module, and it still has all of these fucking config files. and it has all of the dependencies and this insane idea of plugins for everything, which I'm all for plugins. The whole idea of generative building blocks make things extensible, but you gotta do it with some discernment. I mean, I love plugin APIs. And really, this is more a result of all the options you have in the JavaScript community. Because now you have to have a plugin for every possible, not just Vue, but Vue with JSX. See? So unfortunately, Vite, which basically was trying to do more or less the same thing as Hot Web, where it's like, hey, let's start over, focusing on native ESM, etc. But, you know, ultimately it's going to have the same problems as every other thing that came before it. It's the best there is in the JavaScript ecosystem, but it's part of the JavaScript ecosystem. So anyway, I don't want to use it. Anything that makes you use NPM or Node.js is out for Tractor System, because nobody else is going to fucking do that. And then if I can do it and say, hey, look, I can do all this stuff that you want without NPM and tons of dependencies and all that ridiculous, without node modules, then you can kind of look and be like, well, why would I put up with this shit? But as long as there's these kind of incremental things, it's harder and harder to make that point. Obviously, if Vite didn't exist, you know, something like Hot Web that was more developed after, you know, if I focused on it for 2 years, would be significantly more compelling. But unfortunately, Vite is more or less the same thing that also panders to the status quo, which is what people want. But my point will be, everything's simple if you just start over and cut off that dependency on that stupid ecosystem. And unfortunately, that's what Svelte does. It doesn't cut it off. It embraces it. So, you know, how many node modules are in here just for a fucking simple whatever the fuck this is? Like, look at all this shit. The fact that there's modules that start with is, as if it's a single function. They probably have dependencies. Is number. My God. I thought that was supposed to be a joke. And it's a dependency for Svelte. It's a joke in that it is a joke. It is a literal, this is a joke. So to me, that's the biggest reason why I can't get into Svelte. To the point where we started Svelte-ish to see if, how hard would it be to create a Go version of the Svelte compiler? It's not that hard, but it still has a long way to go. And there were all these other issues that I had with Svelte, no small components, etc. And there might be a potential of finding the ideal, which was the whole point of Svelte-ish. It's not just Svelte, it's sort of maybe something different from Svelte. But I can't keep paying for the contractor to keep working on this. the funding situation for program stuff just doesn't really allow me to really spend on contractors like I used to. So if I'm going to do it, I don't want to waste my time going down this rabbit hole of trying to solve the problem for something that I have a pretty good enough solution for, which is using and building around Mithril. We can always do better than this. I think for a lot of the components, I might want to go back to not TypeScript. Even though it's already sort of like transitional TypeScript, it's just a lot easier. Make things simple enough and small enough where the fact that it's not TypeScript doesn't matter that much. You know, find another way to provide documentation or something for components, or bring it back later. But I think going forward, I might not be writing components as TypeScript. JSX is still pretty great. It's compiled on the fly. You can create a function that has nothing to do with the component system that returns some hyperscript tuples that could be used as a utility or whatever. It's great. You have control of what is a component and where it is, and it can be as simple as, at least in Mithril's case, a simple object. Though maybe with decorators or something, you could get back to that pure functional style where you just define a function that returns some JSX. So this experimental thing that I'm kind of starting now is an attempt to return to the Mithril based framework, bringing in, simplifying some of the things. One of the things that I hate in React, and Mithril does this too, is it doesn't pass through things like ID, class, style, various events. Like the fact that you have to explicitly re-expose those is obnoxious as hell when most of them are standard HTML element properties. I want to treat my components as elements as much as possible. If I can't pass class unless I expose class as a parameter, that's obnoxious as hell. So that's what this element wrapper mostly does, is basically lets things pass through. So certain attributes, any data attributes, a lot of events. This could be, I don't know, simplified or cleaned up or something. But I like that functionality. Coming back to web components, it's not that hard to build a web component based on Mithril. And yeah, it's going to depend on Mithril as a standalone component, but the idea is that I want to create sort of the language of the tractor system as Mithril components, and then the high level things, the things that I would actually put in iframes, I would make those web components. And so those things can then be used in other systems, and maybe by then we'll find a way to find a compromise between the Svelte compiled approach and the simple Mithril reconciliation model, where you get the best of both worlds. I believe it's possible, but I don't have the time to figure it out because I have too much to build. So instead of starting to kind of fuck around with the Tractor Toolkit framework, I figured I wanted to start a new prototype call it Visel or Vizel, visual elements. And just start playing with something that's kind of like Hot Web, that kind of does Mithril, basically a better version of some of the stuff that I've done in Tractor Toolkit, extracted from Tractor Toolkit, addressing some of the concerns and things that I've learned since the last time I've done this. Things learned from Svelte, maybe. Things I've learned from looking at all the other fucking frameworks out there. Web components. So this is a great site because it shows you how you could use, you know, one, it's an index of a bunch of fucking frameworks with some kind of categorization. And then it shows you bundle size comparisons for a single web component. You can see Svelte is, the component itself is not that bad, but it does have a runtime that makes it not the smallest, but still smaller than the majority of these. I don't know what the fuck is going on with CanJS. I've never heard of it. You can see wrapping Mithril with HTML element is on the far end of large sizes. But I'm willing to accept that in the short term until something better comes along, because at the end of the day, the component size is still very small. Like all of these, the component size is pretty small, except for a couple of these weird ones. And ultimately, it's just the runtime. And you could probably break down Mithril. Like there's a bunch of stuff in Mithril that you just don't need. You could take that out and it would be even smaller. I think if you were to take that stuff out, you could at least get it closer to the middle. Again, I don't want to make web components for every component. It doesn't make sense. That's why web components never took off. But I do like the idea of creating blocks or high-level components as web components. And so I am excited to do that. And I feel like in those cases, the component logic would be complex enough that it might even justify having a larger runtime. I don't know. But anyway, here's a great example of using Mithril, extending HTML element to create a new web component. We have any of the operations actions, maybe. They manually call their update on connected. This is the main callback for sort of like on mount. Calls update, which is basically just render, saying, hey, let's render to the shadow root DOM node. You can use JSX. Styles, kind of like my style helper, except you have this sort of Svelte-ish way of defining your styles in CSS. You know, because it's as the shadow DOM, you don't have to worry about anything of these being component specific. They will just be component specific. I'm interested in using something like this as a pattern for doing styles for Mithril components. So really, this new project, I'm not really inventing anything. I'm trying to pick the most minimal dependencies in systems to get the most expression I'm making some trade-offs. Oh, if I were to do a web component, it would depend on Mithril. Maybe that won't always be the case, or maybe that will change or whatever. Especially in the context of within the system, there's plenty of other dependencies, and Mithril is already one, so it doesn't really matter. I'm also, you know, because I was very excited about Tailwind as a prototyping tool, also very frustrated how much they depend on the JavaScript ecosystem. I originally wanted to create a Go version of the compiler, which there is a post-CSS kind of compile system for Go, but then I'd have to port all of the JavaScript code they wrote to something else for that to work. And I love the fact, not so much that it's a bunch of utility classes, but it's a kind of a conventional utility classes for a lot of stuff. And it does solve some problems that is nice for them to solve. But again, the amount of complexity, the configuration, different compile, the targets, the fact that you do have to compile it. I love that they created the apply CSS directive to sort of include styles into a new class, to include class styles into a new class. If I just had that, I would be happy. Making Svelte components with that is fucking great. It takes all the ridiculousness of Tailwind classes and puts it all down here. And so then my HTML actually looks fucking clean. The cleanest HTML I've ever seen for anything like this. And then they can have actual semantic classes that can be styled by global style sheets. I also love the fact that variables are in CSS now. And that kind of brings us to, what's it called? Pollen style? Which is basically the whole design system concept, but as CSS variables. And it's not as convenient as Tailwind, but if you're building a system, this seems like a much better primitive to build on. Plus, because of the simplicity of it, I imagine it doesn't have the same kind of ridiculous kind of configuration and stuff to generate them or whatever. So this would be much easier to replicate in Go or something like that, to remove the dependency on any kind of fucking Node.js. So anyway, I'm interested in kind of bringing all this stuff together into a new kind of project that will probably end up back in Tractor Toolkit, but I wanted to play with it separately. And I haven't even gotten started, but at least I kind of got all this thinking out there. There's a lot of weird stuff, like, how does this work? Mithril isn't really a package that you can import that way. So this sort of is making assumptions on, you know, I hate the fact that we have created the JavaScript ecosystem has made the whole import concept pluggable, and they just go to town with it, you know? Like, ESBuild has this problem, and I only say it's a problem, it's actually a good thing, but like, there's no meaning. Like, from Mithril. Mithril where? This is an ES import. That should be a URL. But you have things like, you know, at, or, you know, Svelte has $lib and all that stuff. You can hook into whatever system they use, whether it's Vite, which ultimately is ESBuild, but the fact that you can kind of like change that from a systems point of view is really cool. But you know, for framework creators, but the fact that they take it so far, you know, the fact that you can be like, oh, I want to import CSS. Like, cool, but I would never do that. Because what does that mean? CSS especially, like, the semantics of that is not going to be consistent across systems. And then getting into importing binaries, binary data, JSON. Like, yeah, I guess that's convenient, but to me, that is an indicator of extravagance and no concern for consistency or simplicity. All this is doing is asking for, and I realize probably a big reason they do this in ESBuild is for backwards compatibility, so that systems like Vite can use ESBuild, because there's too many systems that want to do shit like this. But, you know, that's not something I'm gonna support because I think that's dumb. It's super clever. It's super cool and neat. Until you realize the impact that has on the greater ecosystem, and it doesn't fucking read the file off the disk or do a fetch. Why the fuck would you need to import a JSON file? Overzealous. I don't know. There's a certain creativity to it, and it's like JavaScript developers, they're very creative, somewhat out of necessity, in coming up with all these clever hacks and stuff like that to make things work. But you have to realize that they are all hacks, and that the trade-off is now you're potentially creating more problems than you are able to dissolve. And then because people build on those, you're never able to dissolve them until somebody, I'm not trying to be a hero here, but just by nature of creating this strong requirement on the tractor system, will hopefully break this habit and this chain. And then I'm hoping that it will be cool enough stuff built on top of it, with all the modern conveniences and ergonomics, while being incredibly simple. Like, you could, oh my god, I wonder what it would be like to say that there's 1/10,000th the number of dependencies to achieve the same thing. Like, how could you argue with that? You're never going to get GitHub security alerts on your packages because some dependency of a dependency of a dependency had some exploit. I hate having JavaScript projects on GitHub because it's just constant security alerts.